Eleanor Wade threw the wilted wildflowers against the church wall so hard the stems snapped, and every woman in the pew flinched. "I will not cry," she told herself, pressing both fists into her sides until her knuckles whitened. Not here. Not for him. Not for any of them. She was 19 years old, wearing a dress that belonged to a woman 3 inches shorter, and in 11 minutes, she was going to marry a man she had spoken to exactly twice in her life, because her father had wagered her future on a bad harvest and lost. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Eleanor's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's begin. The morning of Eleanor Wade's wedding was the hottest day Call Creek had seen since the summer of 1874, and the heat was the least uncomfortable thing about it. She had been awake since before the rooster. Not because she was nervous, though. She was not because she was grieving, though that too, but because sleep had become impossible the moment she truly understood what the next few hours would require of her. She lay on the narrow cot in the back room of her father's house and stared at the ceiling and listened to Thomas Wade snore on the other side of the wall, and she thought he will sleep through anything. He slept through her mother's last fever. He slept through the winter when they had nothing but cornmeal for 6 days. And now he would sleep right up to the edge of selling his daughter and hand her off without even a catch in his breath. She did not hate him. That surprised her when she examined it honestly. She had expected to feel something sharp and clean. Hatred was at least a direction, at least a thing with edges. What she felt instead was a kind of gray exhaustion, like a field that had been plowed too many times in too few seasons. There was nothing left to turn over. She dressed without a mirror. The borrowed dress Mrs. Aldrich's hemmed badly and too tight across the shoulders smelled faintly of cedar and old lavender. Eleanor buttoned every button herself, slowly, deliberately, and when she reached the collar, she paused with her fingers at her throat and breathed in through her nose until her ribs expanded fully, and then breathed out again. One breath for her mother who died 3 winters ago, and was therefore spared this morning. One breath for herself, who was not. Thomas Wade was already dressed when she came out of the back room. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands, and he looked up at her with an expression she recognized. It was the look he used when he was about to explain something he knew was wrong, but had already decided to do anyway. "You look fine," he said. She did not answer. "Eleanor." He set the hat on the table. "Clayton Hartwell is a good man. He's fair. He don't drink hard. He don't strike women. He's got good land, and—" "Papa." Her voice was quiet, not soft. Quiet the way a closed door is quiet. "I know what he has. You told me. 3 times. Thomas pressed his mouth together. "I need you to understand. I understand everything." She picked up her gloves from the hook by the door. The only things in the room that were truly hers, plain calfskin worn soft at the fingers. "I understand you borrowed $2,000 from a man you couldn't repay, and Clayton Hartwell offered to absorb the debt in exchange for a wife because his last one died 14 months ago and he needs someone to run the house. I understand the arrangement. I have understood it since February." She pulled on the first glove. "What I do not understand is what you expected me to say." Thomas opened his mouth. "Don't." She pulled on the second. "Just take me to the church." The walk through Call Creek was not long. 3 blocks on the main road past the feed store and the assay office, and the Widow Mercer's boarding house with its perpetual smell of boiled cabbage. Eleanor walked with her chin level. She was aware of the curtains moving in windows as she passed. She was aware of Dottie Farnham and her sister stepping off the boardwalk to let her by, which was meant as a kindness, but landed as something else entirely, as though she were a thing to be careful around a wagon with a broken wheel. She heard them talking behind her. She had good ears, always had. "Poor creature," Dottie's sister said. 19 years old and handed off like a parcel." "Clayton Hartwell's no monster," Dottie said. "He's 41. He's rich. Same thing out here." Eleanor's jaw tightened. She did not slow down. The church was a plain building, whitewashed wood, with a bell tower that leaned slightly to the east. Reverend Stokes was already at the door, a small man with careful eyes who had baptized Eleanor 11 years ago, and now watched her approach with an expression she could not quite read. Not pity exactly, but its close cousin. He held the door open without speaking. She appreciated that. She had no patience this morning for words that cost nothing. She stepped inside. The church was fuller than she expected. Half of Call Creek seemed to have turned out, which told her something people came to see transactions the way they came to watch an auction. She kept her eyes forward. The aisle was short, 8 pews on each side, all turned toward the altar where Clayton Hartwell was standing, with his hat already removed, held in both hands in front of him. She looked at him for the first time with something approaching full attention. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked outdoors in all weathers, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that had been weathered by years into something angular and still. His suit was plain dark, well-brushed, not showy. He did not look like a man performing a triumph. He looked, if anything, like a man who had come to fulfill an obligation and intended to do it without fuss. His eyes found hers across the length of the aisle. Eleanor held his gaze. She did not look away first. Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, more like recognition. As though he had been prepared for something different, and found instead this, a girl in a borrowed dress with the posture of a judge walking toward him, with absolute deliberate calm. She reached the altar. "Miss Wade," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. "Mr. Hartwell," she said. Neither of them smiled. There was nothing to smile about yet. But there was something in the air between them, a kind of mutual acknowledgement. Two people who had each chosen practicality over sentiment, and were now obligated to see what that choice produced. Reverend Stokes opened his Bible. Thomas Wade stood 3 paces behind Eleanor, hat in hand. She could hear him breathing. She did not look back. The vows were short. Reverend Stokes knew better than to make this crowd sit through a long ceremony. There was enough theater in the room already, without adding to it. Eleanor listened to the words and repeated them when instructed, keeping her voice steady. When Clayton said his part, he said it looking directly at her, which she had not expected. She had anticipated the practiced avoidance of a man embarrassed by the circumstances. Instead, he was simply present, his eyes on hers, speaking plainly. "I will," he said, and meant, "I will not pretend this is ordinary. I will not lie to you about what it is." "I will," she said, and meant, "then we understand each other." When Reverend Stokes pronounced them married, the church exhaled. Somewhere behind Eleanor, a woman whispered something. She did not catch the words. She accepted Clayton's arm. He offered it formally, not possessively, and they walked back up the aisle together, and she kept her chin level the whole way. And when they stepped out into the blast of morning heat, she blinked against the light and let herself, just for one instant, feel the full weight of what had just happened. Then she folded it away. There was a small gathering outside the church. Not a celebration, exactly, more like the aftermath of a significant weather event. People milling and talking in clusters. Mrs. Aldrich appeared to take back her dress, which involved Eleanor stepping behind the church with her and changing back into her traveling clothes with a speed that suggested they had both planned for exactly this. She handed the dress over without ceremony. "You were dignified," Mrs. Aldrich said, which was the kindest thing anyone said to her all day. The Hartwell Ranch was 4 miles outside town, east on the post road. Clayton drove the wagon himself. Eleanor sat beside him, her small trunk in the bed behind them, and for the first mile, neither of them spoke. The road was dry, and the horses moved at a comfortable pace, and the silence between them was not hostile. It was the silence of people who had not yet determined what to say to each other. Clayton broke it first. "You can have the south-facing room," he said. "It gets a good cross breeze in the afternoon. The north room's darker but cooler at night. Your choice." Eleanor considered this. "South," she said. "I don't sleep well in the heat." He nodded. "Another quarter mile." "You ride?" he asked. "Not well. I can manage a farm horse." "We've got one of those, Dolly. She's old and patient. That suits me. He looked at the road. The hands know you're coming. I told them to give you space to settle. Walt's been with me 12 years. He'll be straightforward with you. The others will take their cue from him. And the housekeeper. Mrs. Puett. She's particular about the kitchen. I'd advise letting her show you her system before suggesting changes. Eleanor turned that over. You think I'll want to suggest changes? I think most women would after a week. She roasts everything. There was a beat of silence, and then to her own surprise, Eleanor almost smiled. Everything? The woman once roasted a fish. The almost smile became real briefly before she caught it and brought it back to neutral. But she had felt it, and she suspected he had seen it, and something in the air between them shifted just fractionally, just enough to suggest that whatever this was going to be, it was not going to be entirely without grace. Hartwell Ranch announced itself first by smell cattle and dry grass and the faint sweetness of something flowering near the creek. Then by sound, the low tack of hooves on packed earth, the distant bark of a ranch dog, a man's voice calling something she couldn't make out. Then they came up over a low rise and she saw it. The main house, 2 stories wide, porch modest by the standards of a wealthy man. Well-maintained, not showy. Consistent with everything she had already observed about Clayton Hartwell. He pulled the wagon up to the front and set the brake and climbed down, then came around and offered his hand. She took it. Got down. Let go. 5 ranch hands were visible in varying states of deliberate casualness, men who had clearly been told not to stare but were making a thorough job of pretending not to. One of them, a weathered man in his 50s with a face like old saddle leather, stepped forward and removed his hat. "Ma'am," he said. "Walt," Clayton said. "This is Mrs. Hartwell." The name landed strangely on Eleanor's ears. She had not been thinking of herself by it yet. She filed that away for later. "Welcome to the ranch, ma'am," Walt said, and his voice was careful but not unkind. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate the welcome." The other hands introduced themselves in turn: Amos Young and red-headed and visibly nervous, Saul quiet and broad-shouldered, Pip, who couldn't have been more than 17, and Reuben, who had the eyes of a man who kept his own counsel. Eleanor looked each of them in the face when they spoke to her. She had learned watching her mother that people remembered whether you looked at them. Mrs. Puett emerged last from the house with the bearing of a woman who had been expecting this moment and had opinions about the timing of it. She was stout and gray-haired and wore an apron that had survived serious use, and she looked Eleanor over with an assessment that made no effort to disguise itself. "You're younger than I expected," Mrs. Puett said. "I am 19. Eleanor agreed. Mrs. Puett looked at Clayton. "Dinner's at 6. "Thank you, Helen," he said. Mrs. Puett withdrew. Clayton met Eleanor's eyes briefly. It was not quite an apology, more an acknowledgement that she had just passed the first test of the day, and he had noticed. Her room had a window that looked south over the kitchen garden, exactly as promised. The cross breeze was real. Her trunk fit under the foot of the bed. The bed itself was narrow, but the mattress was decent, and there was a washstand with a proper mirror and a small writing desk under the window. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at all of it. She had expected to feel like a prisoner. She had prepared for it, the way you prepare for a thing you dread stealing yourself, building small interior walls against it. Instead, she felt something more complicated. The room was hers. Not borrowed, not shared. The south window was hers. The kitchen garden she could see from it, the small rows of beans and squash, and what looked like herbs at the far edge, she could tend that if she chose. The thought was small, but it was the first thought all day that had any warmth in it. She unpacked her trunk herself methodically and put everything in its place, and then she washed her face and her hands and straightened her collar and went downstairs. Mrs. Puett was in the kitchen at the stove, and the smell was entirely beef. "I'd like to learn your schedule," Eleanor said from the doorway. Mrs. Puett turned. Her expression was somewhere between surprised and assessing. "You're going to help if you'll show me how things are done here first." There was a pause that felt like Mrs. Puett recalibrating something internally. "Supper's at 6, she said finally. Bread goes in at 2. I'll show you the larder now if you want. I want, Eleanor said. She followed Mrs. Pwitt into the cool dimness of the larder, and she listened carefully, and she asked questions only when she needed to, and she did not suggest a single change. That first night at the dinner table, Clayton sat at the head, and Eleanor sat at his right, and they ate in near silence, which was not uncomfortable, so much as unresolved. He passed the bread before she had to ask. She noted that. She passed the butter back before he reached for it. He noted that. After dinner, he excused himself to review accounts in his study. She offered to wash up, which surprised Mrs. Pwitt enough that the woman stood watching from the doorway for a full minute before retreating. Eleanor washed the dishes alone in the kitchen, with the sound of crickets starting up outside the window, and the day's heat finally beginning to lift, and she thought, this is survivable. More than that, even if she was careful, if she was smart, if she paid attention. She was good at paying attention. And for the first time since February, Eleanor weighed. Eleanor Hartwell. Now she supposed thought about the future without flinching away from it. She stacked the clean plates on the shelf. Outside, a night bird called from somewhere near the creek. She dried her hands and went upstairs. She learned the ranch the way she had learned everything worth knowing in her life, not by being told, but by watching until the pattern revealed itself. The second morning she was up before Mrs. Pwitt. She had lain awake listening to the sounds of the house settling in the dark, cataloging them, the creak of the third step on the staircase, the way the kitchen door dragged slightly on its frame, the distant sound of Walt moving through the barn before 5. By the time the sky began to gray at the edges, she had mapped the rhythm of the place as thoroughly as if she had lived there a month. Mrs. Pwitt found her in the kitchen with the fire already built up and the water already heating. The housekeeper stopped in the doorway and looked at the stove, and looked at Eleanor, and did not say anything for a long moment. I didn't touch the bread starter, Eleanor said without turning around. I know you said you manage it yourself. Another pause. The coffee's in the blue tin, Mrs. Pwitt said finally. I found it. Mrs. Pwitt came in and tied on her apron, and they worked side by side in silence, and it was not the silence of two strangers being careful. It was the silence of two women who had each independently decided that the kitchen was too important to waste on posturing. That was the first morning. By the fourth day, Eleanor had learned that Amos the red-headed hand was terrified of her in the specific way of young men who have been raised to believe women are either delicate or dangerous, and cannot determine which category she belongs to. She solved this by handing him a list of produce she needed from the kitchen garden and asking him to explain which plants were which put him in the position of knowing more than she did, which relaxed him visibly within 10 minutes. By the 6th day, she had learned that Saul, the broad-shouldered quiet one, communicated almost entirely in grunts that had precise meaning. If you paid attention, a short grunt meant agreement, a longer falling one meant doubt. 2 short ones, in quick succession, meant he thought you were making a mistake, but would not say so directly. She started watching for the double grunt. It was almost always right. She had also learned by the 6th day that Clayton Hartwell watched her, not intrusively, not the way a man watches something he owns, more the way a rancher watches a new horse in the pasture, assessing patient without interference, waiting to understand what he was dealing with. She felt his attention at dinner when she offered an observation about the kitchen garden yield. She felt it the morning she reorganized the larder shelving, and he came in for something, and stopped, and looked at what she had done, and then left without commenting. She felt it the afternoon she sat on the porch with the household ledger in her lap, cross-referencing the supply orders against Mrs. Pwitt's record of what had actually been used. That evening at dinner, he said, "You were looking at the accounts." "The supply ledger," she said. "Mrs. Pwitt's records don't match the orders from the feed store. Someone's been overcharging. Or there's wastage that isn't being recorded." Clayton was quiet for a moment, his fork still. "By how much?" $11 over 6 months. Possibly more. I only had this quarter's figures." He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize. It was not surprise exactly. It was more like the recalibration of an estimate he had not expected to need to recalibrate. "I'll pull last quarter's ledger," he said. If you'd like me to review it, she said carefully. I can. I did my father's accounts from the time I was 15. I know what wastage looks like versus deliberate inflation. He was quiet long enough that she thought he was going to decline. Then, I'll leave it on the study desk. She nodded and passed him the bread, and that was that. But she felt later washing up that something had turned over a page or a stone or something similarly small and significant. The ledger was on the desk the next morning. She spent 2 hours with it before breakfast, and by the time she came to the kitchen, she had filled 2 pages of notes in her careful, precise handwriting. She left them next to the ledger. She did not know what she expected from that. She was not sure she expected anything. She had simply done the work because it needed doing. That afternoon, Clayton came to find her in the kitchen garden. She was on her knees pulling early bindweed from between the bean rows, her hands dirty to the wrist, when she heard his boots on the path. She did not get up. You found the feed store discrepancy, he said. There's a second one with the lumber supplier. Smaller $4, but it's the same pattern. Round numbers added to the totals. Not an error. He crouched down to her level, which surprised her. Men of his standing usually conducted conversations from above. You're sure? I'm sure, she said. You want me to write up a formal accounting of it? I want you to teach me how you found it, he said. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not deference, nothing as simple as that. It was the expression of a man who knew what he did not know and was unashamed of the knowing. It took me about 2 hours, she said. I can show you the method. It won't take long to learn. All right, he said. Not right now. My hands are dirty. Something passed through his eyes that might under different circumstances have been amusement. He stood up. After supper, he said. After supper. She agreed and went back to the bindweed. She taught him at the study desk with both ledgers open between them, and he was a better student than she expected. Focused, asking precise questions, not filling silence with unnecessary speech. She showed him how false inflation looked different from honest error, the way round numbers clustered at predictable intervals, the way a careful cheat always left a signature in the rounding. He followed everything. He asked her to repeat one section about cross-referencing supplier invoices against delivery logs, and she repeated it without commentary on the fact that he'd needed it twice. He appreciated that. She could tell. How'd you learn this? He asked when they were done. Necessity, she said. My father was not careful with numbers. Someone had to be. He nodded slowly. The supplier's name on the lumber account is Jessup Crane. I know. His name's on the invoices. Crane's the brother-in-law of the county assessor. Eleanor absorbed this, which means reporting it through the usual channels is complicated. Yes, then don't report it through the usual channels, she said. Pull your business from Crane and don't explain why. A man like that will understand the message. If he pushes back, then you have leverage, you have documented proof of the discrepancy, and he doesn't know how much you know. Clayton looked at her for a long moment. That's a cold way of thinking about it. It's an effective way. She closed the ledger. You asked how I learned accounting. The honest answer is, I learned it because my father trusted the wrong people and I watched the consequences. I'd rather have cold thinking than warm ignorance. The silence that followed was not hostile. It was the silence of a man encountering an edge he had not expected and deciding how he felt about it. Fair enough, he said finally. She nodded and stood up. Good night, Mr. Hartwell. Good night, Mrs. Hartwell. She went upstairs, and she lay in her narrow bed with the south window open and the night air moving across her face, and she thought about the fact that for the first time in as long as she could remember, she had said exactly what she believed to someone who had listened to all of it. It was a strange feeling, not comfortable exactly, but something adjacent to it. The following Tuesday, Walt came to her instead of Clayton. She was in the kitchen making the midday bread when the senior hand appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable in the specific way of a man who has decided to do something he's not sure is his place. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "got a situation with the south pasture fencing. 3 posts down from the dry rot cattle are drifting. Mr. Hartwell's out with Saul at the creek crossing tree came down in the night, and it's blocking the water channel." Eleanor set down the dough. "How many cattle drifting?" "Maybe 12 head toward the Miller property line. Not a crisis yet, but take Amos and Pip and get the cattle back first. I'll send Reuben to the lumber store for replacement posts." She paused. "Do we have the cash account for emergency purchases, or does it go through Mr. Hartwell?" Walt blinked. "There's a household account. Mr. Hartwell said you'd have access." "Then I'll authorize it. Go get the cattle." Walt put his hat back on. He was halfway out the door before he stopped and turned back. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice carried something she had not heard from him before, a kind of settled respect, different from the careful courtesy of the first week. "Yes, ma'am." She sent Reuben with the authorization note, finished the bread, and went back to the kitchen garden. 2 hours later, when Clayton returned from the creek crossing with mud on his boots and a deep tiredness around his eyes, Walt met him at the barn and told him what had happened. Eleanor was not there for that conversation. She heard about it from Amos, who repeated it with the enthusiasm of a young man who had witnessed something he found impressive. "Walt told him straight," Amos said, handing Eleanor the basket of beans she'd sent him to pick. "Said you handled it clean. Said, and this is direct, he said you handled it the way a rancher's wife ought to handle it." Eleanor took the basket. "Mind you don't trample the squash vine on the left there." Amos looked at the squash. "Yes, ma'am." Then carefully, "Mr. Hartwell didn't say nothing, just nodded. But Walt says when Mr. Hartwell just nods like that, it means he's satisfied." "Good to know," Eleanor said, and sent him back to his work. That evening at dinner, Clayton said nothing about the fencing, or the cattle, or the lumber account. He asked her instead how the kitchen garden was coming, whether she thought the bean yield would be enough for the autumn preserving, whether Mrs. Pete had shown her the cold cellar. It was the most conversational he had been at the table since the wedding. She answered each question directly and asked 2 of her own, and they carried on like that until the food was gone, and it felt not like a married couple, not yet, and perhaps not in any way she would have recognized from the outside, but like 2 people who were beginning cautiously and without ceremony to build something that had not existed before. After dinner, she helped Mrs. Pewitt with the preserving jars, and the housekeeper said without looking up from her work, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Eleanor asked. "I expected a girl," Mrs. Pewitt said. "Still halfway a child, scared and homesick, crying in that room at night." Eleanor thought about the nights she had lain awake mapping the sounds of the house. "I was scared," she said honestly. "You didn't act it." "Acting scared doesn't help anything." Mrs. Pewitt was quiet for a moment, turning a jar in her hands. "Margaret, Mr. Hartwell's first wife, she was a gentle woman, sweet-natured, loved this house." She set the jar down. "She wasn't strong, not in the way a ranch requires." Eleanor understood this was not a comparison offered lightly. "I'm sorry for her," she said. "And I'm not trying to replace her." "No," Mrs. Pewitt said. "I can see that." She picked up the next jar. "That might be why it's working." Eleanor carried that thought upstairs with her. The lamp on her desk threw its small circle of light, and she sat in it and opened the notebook she used for figures, and turned to a blank page and wrote in her careful hand a list not of tasks or accounts, but of what she actually knew about the life she was building here. The land, the animals, the people, the patterns, the places where she could be useful, and the places where she was still finding her footing. The list was longer than she had expected. She closed the notebook and blew out the lamp and lay in the dark with the south window open and the smell of the kitchen garden coming in on the night air, the beans and the squash and the small hardy herbs along the far edge, and she thought, I planted half of that, already, in less than 2 weeks. She thought about roots, how they went down before anything came up. Invisible work in dark soil, and how the whole visible plant depended on that invisible labor. How you couldn't rush it. How the ground had its own requirements. She thought she might be beginning to understand something about patience that she had not understood before. Outside, the night bird called from the creek again, the same one as before, or one very like it. She had started to think of it as hers unreasonably, she knew, but a person had to claim something. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow, Walt had mentioned the south pasture gate needed rehanging. She had already noted that the hinge style matched the spare hardware in the barn workshop. She would mention it to Saul in the morning. 2 short grunts would tell her if she was wrong. She was fairly certain she wasn't. She was asleep before the night bird finished its call. The shoulder happened on a Thursday. Eleanor was in the study reviewing the quarterly feed accounts when she heard the commotion in the yard, not shouting exactly more the sudden concentrated noise of several men moving fast toward a single point. She was at the window before she had consciously decided to move, and what she saw was Walt and Saul half carrying Clayton toward the house, his left arm held tight against his body, his face the color of old ash. She was at the front door before they reached the porch. "What happened?" she said. Not a question, a demand for information fast and clean. "Horse spooked at the creek crossing," Walt said. "He went down hard on the rocks, left shoulder." "Get him to the kitchen," she said. "The table's clear." "Ma'am, I can get the doc from Doc Fenner's in Mill Haven until Saturday. I know he told Clayton at the market last week. Get him to the kitchen." Saul met her eyes over Clayton's head and gave one short grunt and turned them toward the kitchen door. Clayton had not made a sound through any of this. That told her more than the injury itself. A man who stayed quiet when he was hurting was either very controlled or very experienced at pain, and she suspected Clayton was both. She pulled a chair out from the kitchen table, and Walt and Saul lowered him into it, and she crouched in front of him without ceremony and looked at his face. "I need to examine the shoulder," she said. "I'm going to cut the shirt." His jaw tightened. "It's a good shirt. I'll buy you another one. Hold still." She took the kitchen shears from the hook and cut the sleeve from shoulder to cuff with 3 clean strokes, peeling the fabric back carefully. The shoulder joint was already swelling, the skin darkening at the outer edge of the collarbone, and when she pressed 2 fingers lightly along the joint line, he inhaled sharply through his nose but did not move. "Not broken," she said. "Separated, I think. The ligaments." She pressed again more carefully this time, feeling for the specific give that meant dislocation versus the resistance that meant something structural had torn. "Have you had this before?" "Other shoulder, 8 years ago." "Then you know it's going to hurt considerably more before it hurts less." "I know. Walt, I need the whiskey from the study cabinet, the good bottle, not the cooking one." She looked at Clayton. "You're going to want it." "I don't need." "I didn't ask what you need," she said, and her voice was calm and absolute, and something in his expression shifted, not submission, more like the recognition of a competence that outranked his preference. He closed his mouth. Walt brought the whiskey. Eleanor poured 2 fingers into a cup and set it in front of Clayton, and stepped back and let him make the decision. He picked up the cup and drank it without argument. She worked steadily for the next 40 minutes. She had set a shoulder before her uncle's when she was 16 after a barn accident, and she did not pretend to herself that this was easy or that she was fully certain. But she knew the mechanics of it, she had steady hands, and she knew that hesitation was more dangerous than commitment. She told Clayton exactly what she was going to do before she did each thing which she suspected no one had ever done for him in a medical situation, and she watched his face and adjusted her pressure based on what she read there. When it was done, the joint seated back, the arm bound tight across his chest with strips from the flour sack she sacrificed for the purpose. He was pale and sweat damp, and more exhausted than she had ever seen a person who was technically still upright. She poured him another measure of whiskey and set it by his hand. "You need to stay still for the rest of today and tomorrow," she said. "And you need to eat something now before the whiskey and the shock catch up with you. I'll make it." He looked at her. His voice, when it came, was quieter than usual. "You've done this before. Once, my uncle." "You didn't hesitate." "Hesitating would have made it worse." She turned to the stove. "Amos, go tell the hands Mr. Hartwell is going to be fine, and that Walt is in charge of the afternoon work. And tell Mrs. Pwitt I said she can take the rest of the day. I've got the kitchen." Amos went. Walt lingered in the doorway. "He's all right," Eleanor said without turning from the stove. "Yes, ma'am," Walt said. And there was something in his voice she had not heard before, not just respect, but a particular quality of trust that a man like Walt did not extend easily or quickly. He left. She made broth from the stock she had been building all week, plain and hot, and she put cornbread beside it, and she set both in front of Clayton without comment. He ate slowly, his right hand doing all the work, and she sat across from him and drank her own coffee and waited. "Margaret couldn't stand the sight of blood," he said midway through the broth. Eleanor looked up. He wasn't looking at her, he was looking at the table, and his voice had the careful quality of a man testing the weight of a door before he opens it. She was a fine woman, good-hearted. But the ranch, the physical reality of it, it frightened her. She spent most of our marriage a little frightened. Eleanor said nothing. She understood she was not being asked to respond yet. "I think that was partly my fault," he said. I'm not a man who explains things much. I thought she'd adjust. She never quite did." "How long were you married?" Eleanor asked. 7 years. He looked up then. "William, our son, he died at 3 days old. She never recovered from it, not fully. She was sick in one way or another for the last 4 years. The kitchen was very quiet." Eleanor thought about a woman who spent 7 years a little frightened in a house that didn't quite fit her, and she felt something soft and painful for someone she had never met. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm not telling you to make you sorry," he said. "I'm telling you because—" He stopped, looked at his broth. "Because you handled this afternoon the way I would have wanted someone to handle it, and it seemed dishonest not to say so. And because you're living in a house with her history in it, and you deserve to understand what that history is." Eleanor set down her coffee cup. She looked at him directly the way she had in the church on their wedding day. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." He nodded once, and they finished the meal in the kind of silence that had weight to it. Not the empty silence of strangers, but the full silence of two people who have exchanged something real and are sitting with the significance of it. That night, Eleanor lay awake for a long time, not with the restless mapping of the house's sounds, as she had in the first days, but with something quieter. She was thinking about Clayton's face, when he had said Margaret's name. Not grief exactly, more like the settled ache of something long carried. She was thinking about the fact that he had told her. That he had chosen to tell her not as a warning or an obligation, but as an offering of context. As a form of respect. She was thinking about what it meant to be respected by a man who did not give that particular thing cheaply. She did not reach any conclusions. She simply held the thought and looked at it from several angles and eventually slept. The following week, the man from the bank arrived. His name was Gerald Pratt, and Eleanor knew the type before he climbed down from his buggy, the carefully fitted suit, the watch chain, the way his eyes moved across the ranch with the calculating quality of a man totaling assets. He asked for Clayton at the door, and Eleanor told him Clayton was resting under doctor's orders, which was only slightly an exaggeration since Doc Fenner had confirmed the shoulder diagnosis on Saturday and ordered 3 days of restricted activity. "I'll come back," Pratt said, already moving to leave. "Or you could tell me what you need," Eleanor said. He stopped, turned back, looked at her with the specific expression of a man deciding whether a woman is worth his time. "This is ranch business, ma'am. I'm the ranch's bookkeeper," she said. It was the first time she had said it aloud. It surprised her slightly how natural it felt. "And I'm Mrs. Hartwell, so anything pertaining to the property and accounts pertains to me. What's the nature of your visit?" Pratt's expression did a complicated thing. He was recalculating. She could see it the way the assessor had recalculated when she corrected his figures at the market in March. "The quarterly mortgage note," he said, his tone shifting to something slightly more careful. "It's due in 10 days. There was a question about the payment amount. There's been a county reassessment that affects the rate. By how much?" A pause. $12. "Upward or downward?" Another pause longer. "Downward. So the bank owes us an adjustment." It's more the process of reassessment requires. Mr. Pratt. Her voice was pleasant and utterly immovable. I have the original mortgage agreement. I have the county reassessment notification that arrived last Tuesday, and I have a running account of every payment made on this note for the past 6 years. Would you like to come in and review the figures together, or would you prefer to send someone from the bank who has authority to make the adjustment on the bank's behalf? The silence that followed was the silence of a man who had walked into a room expecting one thing and found another. I have authority, he said. Then please come in. She seated him at the study desk, set the relevant documents in front of him in precise order, and stood beside the desk while he reviewed them. He made 2 attempts to introduce complications. The wording of the reassessment clause. The question of accrued interest on the variance, and she responded to each one with the specific paragraph and line number that addressed it, because she had read the mortgage agreement twice on Sunday afternoon when she had nothing else pressing. When he left 40 minutes later, the adjustment had been agreed in writing, and she had his signature on a letter acknowledging the overage and committing the bank to applying it against the following quarter's note. She put the letter in the document file and went to check on Clayton. He was sitting up in the armchair in his bedroom with a book he was clearly not reading, and when she appeared in the doorway, he looked at her with an expression she had learned to recognize, the recalibrating look, the one that meant she had done something he had not expected, and he was updating his understanding accordingly. Pratt's been and gone, she said. I heard voices. He came about the quarterly note. There's a reassessment adjustment in our favor, $12. I got it in writing. Clayton was quiet for a moment. Pratt doesn't give adjustments in writing. He finds reasons to complicate them. He found 2 reasons, she said. They didn't hold. He looked at her. Something was building in his expression that she couldn't immediately name. It was not quite admiration, not quite gratitude. It was something more fundamental than either something that had to do with being surprised in a direction you hadn't been surprised in for a very long time. Eleanor, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it land somewhere behind her sternum, precise and unexpected. The letter's in the document file, she said, keeping her voice even. You should look at it when you're up, and you need to stay in that chair for the rest of the afternoon. She turned to go. Thank you, he said. She stopped in the doorway, did not turn back. Rest, she said, and went downstairs. In the kitchen, she stood at the counter for a moment with her hands flat on the wood and breathed carefully in through the nose and out slow, and told herself it was nothing. A name, just a name. Just the shift from formal address to familiar. That happened eventually in any functional household, nothing more than that. She almost believed it. That Saturday at the weekly market in Call Creek, they went together for the first time since the wedding. Clayton's shoulder was still bound, but he was upright and his color had returned, and Eleanor walked beside him through the market stalls with the household list in her hand, and noted with precision the exact moment when the dynamic between them became visible to the town. It was at the dry goods counter. She was reviewing the price on a bolt of muslin when she heard Dottie Farnham's voice 2 stalls over. There she is, still at it, playing at being a rancher's wife. And before Eleanor could decide how to respond, Clayton's hand was at the small of her back, the lightest possible contact, and he turned toward the sound and said in a voice that carried exactly as far as it needed to, Mrs. Hartwell manages the household accounts for the ranch. She found 2 supplier discrepancies and a bank adjustment in her first month. I'd say she's doing the job considerably better than playing at it. Absolute silence from Dottie Farnham's direction. Eleanor did not look up from the muslin. She did not need to. 3 yards, she told the dry goods man, her voice perfectly steady. The medium weight. Clayton's hand dropped from her back. He moved to look at something on the next shelf. They did not discuss what had just happened. They did not need to. But walking back to the wagon with the parcels, she was aware of something that had not been there before, a new arrangement of the space between them, less careful, less provisional, as though 2 people who had been testing the ground had each independently concluded it would hold. She stored that conclusion the way she stored everything useful carefully in a place she could find it again without making more of it than it was. But she did not make less of it either. The letter from Thomas Wade arrived on a Monday. Eleanor recognized her father's handwriting on the envelope, cramped and listing to the right, the way a man writes when he is not entirely sober. And she stood in the hallway holding it for a long moment before she opened it. Mrs. Pewit passed through without comment, which meant she had seen the expression on Eleanor's face and made the wise decision to keep moving. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph was an inquiry after her health, which was not something Thomas Wade had concerned himself with notably when she was living under his roof, so Eleanor read it for what it was: preamble. The second paragraph described a business opportunity, a land purchase on the eastern edge of the county, good grazing land, at a favorable price, if only he had the capital. The third paragraph asked with the elaborate indirectness of a man who cannot bring himself to be direct about something shameful, whether Eleanor might speak to her husband about a loan of $300. She read it twice. Then she folded it, put it in her apron pocket, and went back to the kitchen garden. She pulled weeds for 40 minutes without thinking about the letter. Then she thought about it very precisely for 10 minutes. Then she went inside and wrote a reply. She did not tell Clayton about the letter that day, or the next. She was still deciding what the telling meant, not whether to do it. She had concluded almost immediately that she would, but what she wanted to say alongside the facts, and she had learned that it was worth taking time to know your own mind before you opened it to someone else. On Wednesday evening after dinner, she put the letter on the table between them. "My father wrote," she said. Clayton picked up the letter and read it. His face did not change much, a slight tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible shift in the set of his jaw. "You've replied?" he asked, setting it down. "Yes. I told him the answer was no." He looked at her. "You didn't want to discuss it first?" The answer was no, regardless of discussion. "I didn't want to waste your time with a conversation that had only one conclusion." She met his eyes. "But I thought you should know it happened." He was quiet for a moment. "He put you in this position once. Now he's using that position to ask for more." "Yes." "Does that make you angry?" The question surprised her, not because it was intrusive, but because it was direct in a way she had not expected, and because the honest answer was more complicated than she wanted it to be. She thought about it carefully before she answered. "It makes me tired," she said. "Anger takes energy I'd rather use on something productive. What I feel about my father is mostly exhaustion, and a kind of grief for who he might have been if he'd been different." Clayton looked at his letter on the table. "My father was a hard man," he said. "Not cruel, just absent, even when he was standing right in front of you." He picked up the letter and handed it back to her. "You handled it right." She took the letter. "I know," she said, not from arrogance, but from the calm certainty of a woman who has thought a thing through and arrived at solid ground. He almost smiled at that. She was beginning to know, the almost smiles, the slight softening at the corner of his mouth, the brief warmth in his eyes before the habitual reserve came back down. She was beginning to collect them, the way she collected useful information carefully and without making too much of it. Almost. The following Sunday, Reverend Stokes came to dinner. This was apparently a tradition, monthly rotating through the prominent households of Call Creek. The Reverend took a Sunday meal and thereby kept his finger on the pulse of the community, which was a diplomatic way of saying he gathered information while appearing to offer fellowship. Eleanor had been informed of this by Mrs. Pewit, with the particular tone of a woman who considers it her duty to prepare someone for an experience she herself finds tiresome. She was ready. Reverend Stokes arrived at noon with the expression of a man who expected to find things in a certain order and was already recalibrating as he stepped through the door. Eleanor received him in the front parlor, offered him tea before he could ask for it, and seated him in the chair that had the best light, which she had identified as the chair that made people feel comfortable enough to say more than they intended. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, settling in, "you've settled into the ranch admirably." "Thank you, Reverend." "I'll admit, when the arrangement was first announced, there were those among my congregation who expressed concern." He let the word sit there, testing how she would respond to it. "I imagine there were," she said pleasantly. "Change concerns people." They felt the circumstances might not be conducive to a stable household. "The circumstances produced a very stable household," she said. "The accounts are accurate, the ranch is running efficiently, and I expect the kitchen garden to yield enough for winter preserving with a surplus. If your congregation needs evidence of stability, I can provide the ledgers." Stokes blinked. He had not been expecting ledgers. "That's no. I'm sure that won't be necessary." "I didn't think so." She smiled at him, warm and unyielding in equal measure. More tea. Clayton arrived from the yard midway through the meal, apologizing for the delay with the calm brevity of a man who does not feel the need to over-explain himself, and took his seat at the head of the table. What happened over the next hour was something Eleanor stored away afterward and examined with considerable interest. Every time Stokes directed a question about the ranch toward Clayton, Clayton answered briefly and then said something like, "Eleanor manages that aspect," or, "You'd want to ask my wife, she has a more complete picture of the figures." Not deflecting, not diminishing his own authority. Redistributing credit with the matter-of-fact precision of a man who found it natural and unremarkable. Stokes left at 2 o'clock, looking slightly dazed. "You did that on purpose," Eleanor said when they were alone. "Did what?" "Directed every question about the accounts to me." "The accounts are your area," he said, picking up his coffee. "I answered the questions about cattle and land, because those are mine. Seemed straightforward." She looked at him for a moment. Stokes came here expecting to find a young woman decorating a house and a rancher managing his business. He's going back to town with a different story. "Is that a problem?" "No," she said. "It's useful." "Then it seemed straightforward," he said again, and drank his coffee. She was still thinking about that Tuesday morning when Pip came running from the South Road with news that replaced everything else in her mind with cold, focused urgency. "Ma'am." He was out of breath, his face flushed. "Man at the gate. Says he's a surveyor. Got papers. Says the county's reassessing the eastern boundary line, says there's a dispute about the Lower Creek easement." Eleanor set down the flower she was holding. "Where's Mr. Hartwell?" "North pasture. Half-hour's ride." "What's the surveyor's name?" "Didn't give one. But ma'am, he's got a county seal on the papers, and he's got another man with him well-dressed, not a laborer." She was already untying her apron. "Bring them to the front porch. Don't let them onto the property past the gate until I've seen the papers." She went to the study first. Third drawer. The property file. The original deed. The county survey from 1869. The easement agreement for the Lower Creek water rights that she had found cross-referenced and refiled in August when she reorganized the document system. She had read every word of that easement agreement because it described the water access that kept the South pasture viable through the dry season. And she had known instinctively that water rights in this county were the kind of thing that attracted the attention of people who wanted what you had. She took the documents and went to the front porch. The surveyor was a thin man with professional equipment and the slightly apologetic manner of someone doing a job he has been sent to do rather than one he initiated. The other man, well-dressed as Pip had said, with the sleek self-possession of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted without friction, introduced himself as Mr. Aldous Crane. Eleanor's attention sharpened. Crane. The same name as the lumber supplier who had been inflating invoices. Brother-in-law to the county assessor. "Mrs. Hartwell," Crane said with the particular condescension of a man who expects a woman to fetch her husband rather than engage with him directly. "If we could speak with Mr. Hartwell." "Mr. Hartwell is occupied. I manage the ranch's property and account matters. What's the nature of the boundary dispute?" Crane's expression went through several adjustments. He handed her the papers. She read them. Carefully, completely, the surveyor watching her with something approaching curiosity, and Crane watching her with the beginning of unease. The document claimed a resurvey of the county's water rights allocations, identifying a potential encroachment of the Hartwell Lower Creek easement on land now being claimed by the Crane Land and Development Company. It was, she understood immediately, an attempt to invalidate the easement. Without the Lower Creek water access, the South pasture was marginally viable in good years and worthless in dry ones. The south pasture represented roughly a third of the ranch's grazing capacity. She looked up from the papers. "This resurvey," she said. "When was it commissioned?" "Last month," Crane said. "By the county." "By the county assessor's office." She kept her voice pleasant. "Your brother-in-law's office." The silence that followed had a texture to it. "I'm not sure what you're implying," Crane began. "I'm not implying anything," she said. "I'm identifying the chain of authority that produced this document, which is relevant to its legal standing." The original easement agreement was registered with the Territorial Court in 1869, predating the current county assessor's jurisdiction by 11 years. A county-level resurvey cannot invalidate a territorial court registration. She held the papers out to him. "You're welcome to test that position. I'd recommend having your legal representation review the territorial registration documents first. We have certified copies." They did not have certified copies. They had one original, and Eleanor's very clear memory of the territorial court stamp in the lower left corner of the original deed. But Crane did not know that. Crane looked at the papers she was holding out. He did not take them immediately. "The Crane Land and Development Company has significant interests in this county," he said, and his voice had dropped to something that was not quite a threat, but was designed to feel like one. "I'm sure it does," Eleanor said. "That's not relevant to the territorial registration status of this easement. Have a safe ride back to town, Mr. Crane." He took the papers. The surveyor, to his credit, met her eyes briefly as he turned to go and gave her a small nod, the acknowledgement of one professional to another, quick and quiet there and gone. She stood on the porch until they were through the gate and down the road, and then she went inside and stood in the hallway and let herself feel for exactly 30 seconds the full impact of what had just happened. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. But something was shaking slightly somewhere deep inside her chest. Not fear, she examined it and confirmed it was not fear, but the aftershock of adrenaline and the weight of understanding what Crane's appearance meant. This was not over. A man like that did not come personally unless the stakes were significant. He would come back with better papers or different leverage or both. She went to the study and wrote down everything. The names, the document content, the exact wording of the easement clause. She had cited the fact of the county assessor relationship, while it was all fresh and precise in her memory. Then she sent Pip to bring Clayton back from the north pasture. When Clayton came in with trail dust on his jacket and the alert expression of a man who has been summoned and knows it matters, she put the written account in front of him and stood beside the desk while he read it. He read it once, then again. "Aldous Crane," he said. "The lumber supplier's family." "Yes." His voice was quiet and entirely focused. "I've known Crane was looking at expansion in this county. I didn't know he'd moved to the easement." He looked up. "You cited the territorial registration." "It's the strongest ground. A county resurvey can't touch it." "We need certified copies," he said. "I know. I can write to the territorial court office tomorrow. The registration number is on the original deed, and I can request certification by post. It'll take 10 days. And in 10 days we have documentation that makes the easement untouchable." She paused. "Unless he moves faster than that." Clayton leaned back in his chair. He was looking at her with the full weight of his attention, the way he had that first evening when she had found the supplier discrepancy, but deeper now, as if the person he had been calibrating his understanding of had grown considerably larger than the space he had originally allocated for her. "Eleanor," he said. "Don't," she said, and her voice was not unkind. "Don't make it larger than it is. I read the documents. I knew the law. It needed doing, so I did it." "I'm not making it larger than it is," he said. "I'm recognizing it at its actual size." He held her gaze. "That's different." She looked at him. The study was quiet around them, the afternoon light coming through the window at a low angle, and the thing in the air between them had changed again, had shifted and clarified and settled into something that had no name. She was willing to give it yet, but that was undeniably real and undeniably present. "Write the letter to the court tomorrow," he said. "I already drafted it in my head on the walk from the porch. Of course you did. And this time the almost smile was not an almost. It was real and brief, and it changed his whole face, and Eleanor looked at it, and then looked away, and went to put on the kettle, because something had to be done with her hands. The letter to the territorial court went out the next morning, and Eleanor spent the 10 days waiting for the response, doing what she always did when there was nothing immediate to act on. She worked. She finished the autumn preserving with Mrs. Pewitt. 34 jars of beans and squash and pickled beets lined up on the cold cellar shelves with the quiet satisfaction of visible countable results. She rehung the south pasture gate with Saul, who watched her measure the hinge placement twice before committing to the drill holes and gave one short grunt of approval that she had come to value more than most people's elaborate praise. She finished her reorganization of the ranch's 5-year account records, creating a cross-reference system that would allow Clayton or anyone else to trace any transaction back to its original invoice within 2 minutes. She also, in the evenings, began teaching Clayton the full accounting method. Not just the fraud detection technique she had shown him in the first weeks, but the complete system: how to read a ledger as a narrative, how numbers told the story of a business's health over time, how to identify trends before they became problems. He was a serious student, the same quality of focused attention he brought to everything, and she found that teaching him required her to articulate things she had always done by instinct, which sharpened her own understanding of why the methods worked. On the 6th evening of these sessions, he looked up from the ledger and said without preamble, "You should have gone to school, a proper one." She looked at him. "Women don't go to the schools that teach this." "I know," he said. "That's what I mean." She held his gaze for a moment. "I learned what I needed." "You learned more than you needed and taught yourself the rest. That's not the same thing as having what you deserved." The directness of it caught her somewhere undefended. She looked back down at the ledger. "The certified copies will arrive by Friday if the court office is efficient," she said. He let her redirect. That was one of the things about him she had come to rely on. He knew when to press and when to let something settle at its own pace. "And if Crane moves before Friday?" he asked. "Then we use the original and the letter I've already drafted to the county judge laying out the conflict of interest in the assessor's relationship to Crane land and development. I've had it ready since day 3. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he closed the ledger. "Eleanor." "The letter's in the second drawer," she said. "I'm not asking about the letter." She made herself look up. His face was open in a way she had not seen before. Not the controlled openness of a man choosing to be transparent, but the unguarded openness of a man who has arrived somewhere he didn't plan to arrive and is finding it more solid underfoot than he expected. "I know this wasn't what you chose," he said. "I know your father's debt brought you here and not your own will. I've known that from the beginning, and I've tried not to make it harder than it already was." "You haven't," she said quietly. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly, not diplomatically." She set down her pen. "All right. Are you—" He stopped. Started again with the care of a man choosing words that actually mean what he intends. "Is this a life you can build something in, not tolerate? Not survive? Build?" The question sat between them in the lamplight, and Eleanor looked at it from every angle she had, which was her way with everything that mattered. She thought about the south-facing room, and the kitchen garden, and the ledger system, and Mrs. Pewitt's grudging partnership, and Walt's particular quality of trust, and Saul's grunts, and the 34 jars in the cold cellar, and the letter already drafted in the second drawer. She thought about his hand at the small of her back at the market light as a question. She thought about the way he had said her name for the first time. "Yes," she said. "It is." The certified copies arrived on Friday. She had them filed logged, and a note sent to Crane's office at the Crane Land and Development Company before noon, not threatening, not triumphant, simply informational. The note stated that the territorial court certification of the Hartwell Lower Creek easement had been received and was now on file, that certified copies were available for review by any legally authorized party, and that the Hartwell Ranch considered the matter of the boundary dispute resolved. She signed it, Eleanor Hartwell Ranch Accounts Manager, and she did not consult anyone before sending it. Crane's response came not by letter, but in person, and not to the ranch. He came to the market the following Saturday, which was the kind of tactical choice that told Eleanor everything about how he had decided to play the remaining cards. Public confrontation was the weapon of a man who had lost the legal ground and was attempting to recover through social pressure, which meant he was more vulnerable than he appeared. She saw him before he saw her. He was talking to Gerald Pratt from the bank near the dry goods, and something in the angle of his body and the frequency of his gestures told her the conversation was not going well for him. Clayton was at the feed counter. She went to him and said quietly and quickly, "Crane is here, near the dry goods. He's been talking to Pratt, and from his posture, I think he's already had bad news from someone, possibly a legal advisor. He's going to make a move today, and it'll be in public because it's the only ground he has left." Clayton looked over her head toward the dry goods. "What do you want to do?" The question, "What do you want to do?" landed with its full weight. Not "What should we do?" Not "What do you think?" What do you want? "I want to finish buying the supplies and let him come to us," she said. "If we go to him, it looks like anxiety. If he comes to us on our ground with witnesses who already know him and know us, it looks like what it is." "All right," he said, and went back to the feed counter as if nothing had happened. Crane found them in the wagon 20 minutes later, loading purchases with Walt's help. He had Pratt with him, which was either a show of force or a miscalculation. Eleanor assessed it quickly and concluded it was both. "Mrs. Hartwell," Crane said, "I wonder if we might clear up the matter of the easement documentation. There are questions about the original survey methodology that the certified copies don't resolve." She finished directing Walt on the placement of the feed sacks and then turned to face Crane with the full, unhurried attention of a woman who has done her homework and knows it. "What questions specifically?" "The survey markers from 1869 may not have been placed to current county standards." "Current county standards were adopted in 1878, she said. "The easement predates them by 9 years. Standards adopted after a legal instrument is registered cannot retroactively affect its validity. That's basic property law, Mr. Crane." She tilted her head slightly. "Has your legal representation advised you otherwise?" The brief pause before his answer told her everything. "These matters can be complex." "They're not complex in this case," she said. "The territorial registration is valid. The certification confirms it, and any further challenge would need to be filed with the territorial court directly. That process takes approximately 14 months and requires documented grounds for disputation that, as far as I can determine, don't exist in this situation." She looked at him steadily. "Are you intending to file with the territorial court?" Another pause. Pratt shifted his weight beside him. "We're still reviewing our options," Crane said. "That's your prerogative," she said pleasantly. "If you do file, the Hartwell Ranch will respond in kind. We have the documentation to do so comprehensively." She turned back to the wagon. "Good day, Mr. Crane. Mr. Pratt." She heard them leave. She did not watch them go. Walt was very carefully not looking at her from the other side of the wagon. She could see him not looking the particular elaborate casualness of a man who has witnessed something he considers significant and is processing it. "Walt," she said. "Ma'am." "The flour goes in last on top of the feed." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and if his voice was slightly thicker than usual, neither of them acknowledged it. Clayton came around the wagon. He did not say anything immediately. He took the last parcel from her hands and loaded it himself, and then stood beside her, looking at the market going about its ordinary business around them, the noise and color of a Saturday in Call Creek, and he said, 14 months. You counted on him not wanting to wait 14 months. A land development company needs clear title to move. 14 months of litigation freezes their capital. He won't file." She looked up at him. "Did I read that right?" "Yes," he said. "You read it exactly right." 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, with the air carrying the first real edge of autumn and the kitchen garden putting out its last harvest of the season, Clayton asked her to come to the study. She came in, drying her hands on her apron, and found him at the desk with a document in front of him and the expression on his face that she had learned to read as the face of a man who has made a decision and is at peace with it. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He turned the document so she could read it. It was a property deed. Her name was on it. Eleanor Hartwell. 200 acres the Southfield quarter, and the Lower Creek easement land, the most productive and strategically critical portion of the Hartwell holdings. Transferred into her name, independent and unconditional, held in her right alone. She read it twice. She was aware that her hands, which had been steady through every crisis since the day she arrived, were not entirely steady now. She stopped, started again. "This is a significant portion of the ranch. It's the portion you've protected, managed, and made viable," he said. "It should belong to you. Clayton." Her voice was lower than she intended. You don't need to. I know I don't need to." He met her eyes. "I want to. There's a difference." He paused. "If something happened to me tomorrow, I want you to have ground under your feet that no one can take. Not the bank, not Crane, not your father, yours, in law and in fact." She looked at the deed, at her name on it in clean black ink, irrevocable and documented and real. Eleanor Hartwell. 200 acres. Hers. She thought about February when her father had sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and explained the arrangement with the careful indirectness of a man who cannot look at the thing he is doing. She thought about the borrowed dress and the wilted wildflowers and the walk through Call Creek with curtains moving in windows. She thought about every small battle fought and won in the months between that morning and this one. The ledgers and the larder and the shoulder and the gate and Crane and the 34 jars and the letter in the second drawer. She thought about roots, how they went down before anything came up, how you couldn't rush the ground. "I'm pregnant," she said. The study went absolutely still. Clayton looked at her. She watched his face move through several things very quickly. Surprise. Then something deeper and more complicated. Then a careful steadying. The way a man steadies himself when something enormous has just shifted the ground under his feet, and he is determining whether it has shifted toward something better or worse. "How long?" he said. 4 months, I think. I wanted to be certain before I said anything." He was quiet for a moment. His hand, she noticed, had moved to the edge of the desk, gripping it lightly. "Are you well?" "Yes, I feel well." "Are you?" He stopped, looked at her with the full, unguarded openness she had seen only once before on the evening she had said yes. "This is a life I can build something in." "Eleanor, are you all right with this?" She thought about the question honestly, the way she thought about everything that mattered. She thought about a child who would be born on this land, her land, with a father who asked her what she wanted and listened to the answer and adjusted his estimate accordingly. She thought about what she would teach that child, not just accounting, though, certainly accounting, but the thing underneath the accounting, that competence was not unfeminine, that clarity was not coldness, that a woman who knew her own mind was not a problem to be managed, but a person to be reckoned with. She looked at Clayton Hartwell across the desk, with his hand on the deed that bore her name, and she thought, "I did not choose to come here, but I choose to stay. That is a different thing. That is everything." "Yes," she said. "I'm all right with this." He exhaled a long, slow breath, and then he reached across the desk and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they stayed like that for a moment, in the quiet of the study, with the autumn light coming through the window and the sound of the ranch going about its work outside. Then she pulled her hand back and stood up and picked up the deed. "I'll file this with the county recorder this week," she said, "before Crane's people have any further ideas." "Of course you will," he said. She went to the door, stopped, turned back. "Clayton." He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the land, for treating it as an obvious thing to do." He held her gaze. It was an obvious thing to do. She nodded once and walked out into the hallway and stood in the autumn light with a deed bearing her name held in her steady hands and she felt not the gray exhaustion of February, not the braced endurance of the wedding morning, not the careful, provisional hope of the early weeks, but something solid and sure and entirely her own. Eleanor Hartwell had come to this ranch with nothing but her mind, her hands, and her refusal to break. She was leaving that first version of herself behind now, not because it had failed her, but because she had outgrown the space it occupied. The woman standing in the hallway with a property deed and a child growing and 34 jars in the cold cellar and a letter already filed with the territorial court had not been given this life. She had built it. Every account balanced, every boundary defended, every trust earned, one honest day at a time. And that was something no debt, no arrangement, no man's signature on a piece of paper could ever touch.